Thank you, Arjun. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for making time for our session today. I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion with the panel members that has just been introduced. So I won't introduce them again, but what I will do is call on each one of the panelists to share with us a little bit about what they do, where they're doing it, and maybe some insights on some of the things that they're doing currently with regards to ESG before we move into the main topic of the afternoon, which is the integration of ESG. So let me do a round robin and request Tamara, if you could start and kick off and just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself very
Thank you.
quickly.
Thank you very much, Shareen, and thank you, Carbon Collective, for having me and WeMentor for reaching out. So my background is one that's really anchored in finance. I started my career on trading floors where we were really looking to see how we could deploy capital and do things best. So I've worked managing egos, managing personalities, making difficult governance decisions for the last 20 or so years. I last did this at Singapore's Sovereign Wealth Fund, GIC, who are a large investor in sustainability. I left and took on the role of a head of APAC for a central bank think tank. So I started working with policymakers, multilaterals, asset owners. And in that time, I found myself wanting to do a little bit more. I realized that there was a bit of a disconnection between the way policy worked and cascaded downwards into companies and then impacted people on the ground. So I gave it all up, started a portfolio career, and these days, that's the way I operate. I work in 3 tranches, everything bringing together sustainability, digitization, and finance. At my most intellectual, I still work with the multilaterals and development institutions to try and shape policies that influence the way our ecosystems can be more successful for all kinds of outcomes. In that capacity, I was recently nominated by APEC's Asia Pacific Financial Forum to be their Sherpa for corporate transitions. So really thinking about how companies can start making ESG a way of being. Day to day, I venture build for a US bank. And one of my ventures at the moment is looking at how we can help bridge the financing gap for impactful projects and companies that are probably looking to raise, let's call it 20 million euros to 500 million euros. There is a sustainable financing gap in that kind of window. And day to day, I also work with startups and small companies, as well as social enterprises and charities to help them get to scale. That's me, and I suppose I should hand over to Priyanka since she's off mute.
Great, thank you. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thank you, Tamara. Hello, everyone. Nice to see a lot of participants joining this. My name is Priyanka, and I'm the Sustainability and ESG Manager for SGS Singapore. So SGS is quite well known for its testing, inspection, and certification services. However, we also have a decent-sized sustainability department. So what we do at SGS is a lot on capability building. That includes trainings, workshops, informal and formal workshops. We do a lot of stuff on carbon-related services, which includes accounting of baselining for organizations' carbon footprints, also on products' carbon footprints, helping organizations develop a roadmap towards their decarbonization, and implementing of their policies. We also work with policy for some asset managers, for example, for helping them develop their ESG policy. And a lot of times now these days, those ESG policy include carbon-related targets. So it's very interesting to work with in an ecosystem with holistic point of views where there are top-level approaches, developing policies, as well as towards implementation of them. So it's an interesting space to be when we can do kind of both a top-down as well as a bottom-up approach of developing and implementing. I hand it over to Veera.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Aloysius Wiratmo. I am Program Development and External Engagement at the Indonesia Business Council for Sustainable Development, or known as IBCSD in Indonesia. So IBCSD is a CEO-led business associations of companies operating in Indonesia that have a commitment to support and also adopt sustainability practices. IPCSD was established in 2011 through the process of the Indonesian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and also as a national chapter of World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And IPCSD was founded by 6 members companies and now has been growing into 47 companies, big and small, from various industrial sectors. So IPCSD basically want to support businesses, in particular the members, to translate sustainability sustainability through 6 strategic program areas: food and nature, and then climate and energy, people, circular economy, redefining value, and cities and mobility. Yeah, but
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. So how we're going to run this is that after the introductions we've just completed, there will be one question that I will pose to all 3 of our panelists, and they will have between 5 to 8 minutes to give their opening or the context around the question. There are also a few other questions that will be follow up to that, but let's make it interactive and we'll open it for all of you out there, your questions, you can drop it in the chat box and we'll pick it up. We'll also be launching a poll, and Arjun will help me with the poll. And there are some technical instructions around the poll. You would think it's pretty straightforward, but sometimes it gets in the way. So, but here's the thing. The poll is up, as you can see. And what we'd like to do is actually feel the pulse of the audience and which are the areas that you want us to sort of focus on a little bit more. And thank you, you're putting in your answers very, very quickly. Just put in and say submit and not the other button, otherwise it's all not going to work out. And I won't mention what other button, just do submit. So here we go. Well, the question is, will your firm be able to integrate ESG in the next 3 years? We've got a resounding 71% and counting of you out there who's saying that within the next 3 years, you are quite confident. So that will give our panelists some food for thought, and we'll address it after we do the opening and when we are ready to close the poll. Arjun, give me your cue when you're ready to close the poll so that we can get into the opening remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Shareen. We already have almost 70% of the participants
Brilliant. Nice.
Using the poll, yes. So let's
Sure.
wait for another 10-15 seconds and then we will end the poll.
Okay, good. There will be another poll that we'll put at the end of the session. And this is to actually then see whether the 4 of us, I'll put myself into the mix as well, have assured you or given you more sort of drive towards integrating ESG. So that poll is just to conclude and see whether we've managed to convince you that integration of ESG can happen, will happen, should happen, and everything else in between. Okay, so it's still very much on the high side for the yes, we are confident. So good, we have a good, strong audience then, all raring to go. So we've got our job cut out for us, ladies and gentlemen. So if we can close the poll, Arjun, are we ready to do that?
It's closed.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Thank you for replying. 68% say yes, we are confident, 9% it will take longer, 20% have started but have plans, 3% haven't started and do not have plans. So let's see whether the 3% will turn into at least the 1 or 2 or number 1 or 2 of the poll question. Okay, let's jump in. The opening remarks, like I said earlier, 5 to 8 minutes maximum for each of our panelists. And the question is, what are the trends that you're observing in your sector or in your region, or even in your company or the companies you work with regards to integration of their ESG? And I will ask Tamara to kick us off. Thank you, Tamara.
Thanks, Shareen. So having spent 15 years looking at what's now called sustainability, I think the thing I've really noticed is this incredible focus on carbon, which until I would say the last maybe 10 years hadn't really been easily quantified, and therefore everything became a bit abstract and hypothetical. And then with carbon, we suddenly had something real, something we could measure, that we could track, that we could see progress against. And so there became a flood of effort and financing in that space. Sadly, never enough. No one can ever have too much money, I suppose, in this case. But we're also finding it difficult to deploy the cash most effectively, to make the differences in the meaningful ways that we need to. And so what I see now is a bit more of an understanding that the mechanisms we have had are not quick enough, they're not nimble enough, that things are taking a little bit too long to happen. That's driving, in my mind, this focus on corporate transition, where previously it was very much about, sources of finance, central banks, asset owners, asset managers, pushing corporates through. If you're a private markets player, so you invest directly into companies through their board votes, through their board presence. If you are in the public markets, through where you allocate your money. So we saw people like BlackRock doing more and more in that space. These days, I see a lot of pressure to move beyond carbon, to think about biodiversity, the ocean, so the other aspects of environmental. We talk about methane more and more, and the kind of other greenhouse gases. There's also obviously, in the month that we have International Women's Day, greater focus on social. So I think it was 2 years ago where I was on a panel with some asset allocators out of New Zealand and Finland, also some from Australia, and we were talking about what happens to a community that's been built around coal mines or similar, and those mines are now starting to close down or scale back significantly. What happens to all those people whose livelihoods and history are tied to that industry? So we're thinking more and more about the right way to employ transition. We're thinking more and more about the other things we can affect. We're thinking more and more about, if we do survive the climate crisis, what is the world we want to live in looking like? And how do we make sure those social outcomes are met? I think these days the G is also starting to come up a little bit more. So we've seen this with some of the reasonably big ticket headline failures around the governance of companies. We've seen things like for example, Amazon at one point being outed as using child labor. We've seen more focus on the need to think about these other things. In Asia, Southeast Asia especially, we of course have quite a lot of focus on how we market our companies as being well governed, in the sense of not having corruption entrenched in our systems. We showcase how we use lawful legal labor and how we protect our staff. And then finally, because I don't want to take too long, going back to asset management and finance, where I grew up, I think there has also been a trend for a backlash, which frankly irritates me. But this backlash against woke capitalism, the idea that it's not the job of an asset manager or the like to think about doing things right. Now, this has always existed in sustainability. For as much as there's been a climate scientist, there's been a climate denier. And so I think what's interesting now is how it's getting a little bit more vocal. It's largely, from what I understand, a Western premise, with a lot of legislation being tabled in the US now to prevent active ESG investing by fiduciaries. And I won't get into the detail of that because I think it'll come up later, but that isn't something else I'm keeping an eye on.
Okay, great. Some of the points that you brought up resonate, because I used to work for Khazanah National and a good number of years pushing through shareholder activism, looking at how we put in a lens of ESG or sustainability in the investment decisions that we make. So there's a lot of discussions there, and a lot of debates as well, the right and wrong and what you do with capital. So brilliant. Thank you for that opening. Priyanka, you've got your mic already. Please, your 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't think I'll take 8 minutes. But yes, in case of upcoming trends or generally the trends, we used to see a lot of a lot of trends working from the leadership, which is like more like a top-down approach where the C-suite will decide on what would be the ESG strategy of the organization, and then it trickles down. However, fortunately, I think, and it's a very feel good when it comes bottom up, where the employees ask for it. And again, fortunately, it has been coming up more recently, where the employees are asking for an integration of ESG in their policies and companies. And that's not only the E, but goes beyond. More on the social and the governance aspects also, because when employees read about the employee well-being incorporated in other organizations and as it becomes a more common trend, it just trickles to more employees to having to want that. And ESG is definitely one of the drivers that we see for employee retention. Whenever they feel that their organization is doing something better for the planet, it makes them also feel good. So in terms of trend, again, I think I very much resonate with Tamara on like there was now that carbon is, a kind of a universal currency on understanding the on your impact on the planet. There is a lot of discussion on biodiversity and social, but I would say like on the ground, there is still a lot more on the GHG and the E part of it. And by carbon, I just mostly say carbon, but I mean all the 6, 7 greenhouse gas emissions. And we are seeing a lot of, and those trends are highly driven by regulators. So now, like for Singapore, there's a carbon pricing act, and that makes it mandatory for organizations to pay taxes beyond certain emissions. To report their emissions if they are emitting more than 2,000 tons, let's say. Similarly, for we are seeing more and more asset managers getting into it. So yeah, I know it's a bit irritating to see this woke capitalism. However, I firmly believe that asset managers, fund owners, fund managers, they do have some kind of influence when it comes to moving the needle. Because just by the size of the AUMs they hold sometimes. So I hope that it doesn't become a trend, that woke capitalism and like backlash towards it doesn't become a trend, and it stays more on the positive side, where people are more aware on their impact on the planet, people, and governance generally.
Great, thank you. So we've got quite a good diversity in terms of the sort of countries that we represent, because Tamara and Priyanka is dialing in from Singapore, and of course Vira is Indonesia, and a lot of things are happening in Indonesia as well. Vira, would you please then address the question in your 5 minutes? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Shareen. Yeah, I think I also see the similar trend in Indonesia, that ESG integration among companies in Indonesia. I see and feel, I feel there is a growing interest, but also commitment and also more clear strategy and action plan among companies in their adoption of ESG in their business operation, but also some including also involving or collaborating with the supply chains, their supply chains. And this increasing trend in the beginning, I reflect also is partly because of the support of the emerging regulations, and that relate to or to encourage the business adoption of ESG. For example, the regulation of the implementation of sustainable finance in Indonesia in 2017 that requires public listed companies to report their ESG activities since 2020. And then since the Indonesian adoption of SDGs, the Indonesian government also issued regulation on the implementation of SDGs that requires all key stakeholders, public, government, and non-government, including the private sector, to report their action plan on SDGs, and also to report their plan, but also their practice. So because SDGs basically also relate to the 7 goals related to ESG, so I think this regulation also improve or strengthen or encourage businesses to develop create plan, concrete plans on SDGs. And from year to year, there's been a growing participation from companies. For example, last year there were around 170 companies joining, and previously the number is just only half of them. And CDP in the end of last year, in November 2022 last year, have a study on how companies in Indonesia are using SDGs indicator in their reporting through CDP platform, and it is found that more growing companies, from 50 companies to 70 companies using SDGs indicator, through in their report through CDP platform.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just under your 8 minutes. Thank you very much, Vira.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
There are questions coming through from the chat box. It's very chatty now. Thank you very much. And there's I will go straight to the questions from the audience. Because it's sort of reflecting back what we've been talking about. Before I get to the questions, let me just jump in and talk about a little bit about Malaysia and what's happening here with regards to the regulators, at least Bursa Malaysia, because I sit on the Committee for Sustainability and Development. So a lot of the regulations have come out, guidelines as well, and especially for Malaysia, companies who intend to list would have to have an ESG policy statement at least, and that's the pre-qualification. And then in the 1 year after they've listed, they are required to report on their ESG matrix, and then it grows from there. So in Malaysia, we're also doing a lot through the regulatory kind of function, so a bit of the stick, if I can use that, and the carrots will be a lot of incentives, some government sort of support in terms of companies who are transitioning into a low carbon operations. So okay, so let's go into the questions from Justin, and that's directed at Tamara. And the question says, in terms of the, well, Justin agrees with Tamara, tech-based decarb is fully quantifiable. How can the sustainable financing ecosystem drives this move, the air capture and the carbon capture? Sorry, over to you, Tamara.
Yeah, I was going to get a little bit stuck on fully quantifiable because I think some types of decarbonization have emerging science behind them still. Soil sequestration was something I looked at for a little while, and I was really hoping that we could do stuff in regenerative farming, but the measurements are not quite there yet. But I think the core of it is how can the financing ecosystem drive that more? And so I mentioned earlier that the gap that we see in sustainable financing, where if you're small and fit into sort of nearly philanthropic, foundational, grant-giving, impact type investing spaces, where you're getting financed at under 20 million euros or whatever the case might be, it's not too hard to get financing. There are people out there where if you're mission aligned and you have the ability to prove your impact, there are avenues. I think that things are never easy, but it's not as hard as when you get past that point and you're not quite big enough for the people who have billions of dollars to deploy. So you mentioned Kazana earlier, Temasek, KKR, they have billions of dollars that they want to deploy into decarbonization. When you have to make that much, when you have to invest that much money, you tend to look at things at about $500 million a time, because there's only so much deal assessing that you can do. And so you get coverage at the top and you get coverage at the bottom, and then you have this kind of gap in the middle. And so there are a few things that I think happened there. At last year's G20, it was one of the conversations that came up, which is there is a huge step change in due diligence expectations when you move from taking grant funding and philanthropy and sort of no need to return type money into money that expects a return. And many of the projects I look at do offer a return. They do offer you impact returns as well as financial returns. The problem is often the companies like who are investing in this technology or in these solutions, they're great at talking about impact, not great at talking about business. Or there are companies that are great businesses, not great at talking about impact. And so one of the things I'm venturing in right now with this bank I'm affiliated with is, just how do we help people bridge that communications gap? How do you make sure that you can communicate not just the strength of your impact, but the strength of your business when you're out there looking for fundraising? I think I won't go on too long, but I think the biggest thing that sustainable financiers can do is be sympathetic towards that, to work with these companies to help them with their articulation. I think one problem is they need to be more open with their mandate, like what is it they need so the companies can respond. And then to wrap up, I think there is a lot more work to be done in blended financing. And again, that ties down to mandate and understanding.
And be very specific about what the ask is. I think sometimes when it comes from the project or the project owners, it gets a bit muddled. So for fund managers or people who are analyzing the investments, they need to be very clear what the objectives are. Okay, so the next question I think would be quite good for Priyanka. It's coming from Sekar. And he says, I see published targets of companies focused primarily on scope 1 and 2 emissions, as we know. Less mention of scope 3 because that's rather tough. It's your supply chain and everything else in between. What would be your comment? And then after that, Wira, if you can just jump in on that same question as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. I can start. Thanks for putting up the question. Yeah. Scope 1 is like the one that's directly in your control, and scope 2 can also be kind of reduced if you improve efficiency. So you just kind of buy less electricity, cooling, heat, whatever. So because these are kind of operationally within your control, it's much easier to reduce it as compared to scope 3, which is really about your value chain. We always have to remember scope 3 is someone's scope 1 and scope 2. So if everybody reduces their scope 1 and scope 2 to 0, scope 3 automatically becomes kind of 0. It always, again, I wouldn't fully agree that, okay. So there, I would say like, yes, there are companies that are publishing their targets on scope 1 and 2. However, we are seeing companies working on their scope 3 because they do recognize that it's a large part of their emissions. So while they're working on it, it becomes challenging because a lot of times what we are seeing is that their emissions from scope 3 is actually not from even their tier 1 supplier. It could be from their tier 2 or tier 3 supplier. That is actually the main culprit of their scope 3, let's say, purchase goods and services. Now on tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, they have very little influence. So these are the kind of challenges first, which they have to overcome before they can publicly set up the target of reducing their scope 3. But however, I still feel that the battle is kind of half won if we reduce our scope 1 and scope, if everybody just, focuses on their scope 1 and scope 2, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers as well, their scope 1 and scope 2 is actually making someone's scope 3. So, if we focus on that, and I think we are, I'm not very happy saying that, but there are still a lot of action. There's still a lot of action needed for scope 1 and scope 2 as well.
Yeah. I'm going to push the boundaries with you on that because I don't think it's as straightforward as when you do scope 1 and scope 2 well, that scope 3 kind of like, gets sorted. I understand there's a lot of complexity around that as well. Yeah. Wira, you want to jump in with your thoughts?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Yes. In Indonesia now, I think companies or business movement to net zero also very strong. Yeah, a strong movement now. And this one actually I want to say in my opening remark before, but I ran out of time. But at the moment, there is a consortium or collaboration and the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce and also IBCSD in collaboration with knowledge partner, WRI and also CDP that they are founding members for SBTI, and we try to provide capacity building as well for companies using GHG protocol, the global standard that also has been used by the companies at global level. And our focus also in the beginning is scope 1 and scope 2. Scope 1 is to manage the direct emission from its companies, and then the scope 2 in the way they use the energy. And at the moment we encourage them, we provide capacity building training, and the aim is also in particular to enable the companies to manage their scope 1 and 2 emission. And then actually, finally, they are expected to join in the international standard, in particular the SBTI one, to join the SBTI, so that their initiative or their action to reduce emission is like also verified by the third party at international level even.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Some of the comments that are coming through are anchored on carbon and E, but I would suggest and I would argue that E is beyond just carbon, right? We're talking also about waste management, we're talking about biodiversity and everything else. Like Tamara's opening remarks, and we say that a lot of the companies are anchoring on carbon or GHG emission purely because there's a quantifiable sort of mechanism that you can price carbon and things like that. I think we also need to look at waste management. We also need to look at the broader aspect of impact on biodiversity and all that as part of the E. Putting it in there for your thoughts to come through for the audience. If we go back to the questions, Oliver has got a question on whether governments have got incentives for companies who are investing in low carbon technologies and practices. I'll start off with saying with Malaysia, not quite yet. We're still wrapping our head around how do we incentivize companies to actually look at a more low carbon transition. I think even with the current budget that was announced for 2023, not quite clear in terms of incentives. What about what's happening in Singapore? Tamara and Priyanka, if you want to just take it up. Thank you.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit about Singapore, and I'll pass it on to Tamara. I think she can give better insights from the green finance point of view. There are some grants, like for Singapore, I would say there is Enterprise Singapore, which also helps SMEs towards who are working on technologies on reducing emissions and generally on the ESG space. Banks frequently now have targets on their loans towards their ESG, towards companies achieving ESG agendas. So that's something that we are seeing in terms of helping organizations when they're trying to help towards the technologies. I pass it on to Tamara.
Thanks. So I think when I saw that question, my first thought was which government and where. There are multitudes of incentives all over the world, and some of them are international in nature as well. Singapore does have a bunch of schemes, as Priyanka's discussed, and there are other things like government-backed incubators, accelerators, plans. I think the thing that is interesting right now, and I don't know whether this is going to be as interesting for the group, we've gone from having incentives and carrots. So, here's a tax incentive, here's a credit, to getting closer to the stick. So I think Singapore is unique in Asia right now for having declared its carbon taxation pathway. And the carbon tax is going to go up almost 8 times in just a few years. And I thought that when that first came out, I was like, oh, it's a very bold step. What's that going to do to the competitiveness of the economy? I think the reality is, if we do look at the carbon markets, they are clearly not working, and the pricing is absolutely incorrect. And so I think Singapore has been reasonably brave in pushing forward with that change and announcing it so clearly. I had thought that Japan would follow. So Japan has its mandatory markets up already. Prices are very, very low. I suspect that will come. I know Indonesia, and perhaps you can speak more about this, they're kind of trialing the idea of creating a carbon market, but not making it mandatory as yet. So there are things happening along the way where it's getting a little bit less incentives driven as opposed to disincentive driven, which is potentially going to be more effective in time. Wira, any thoughts on Indonesia?
Okay, just probably just to add on, yeah, I think there's been actually there's discussion among businesses as well to government in particular to provide more a kind of more significant incentive for the companies that more advanced in applying or in making transition into the low carbon economy. Yeah, but at the moment it's still a kind of waiting. Yeah, even some regulation still we need like more operational guidance, for example, on the carbon tax, and then on the carbon trading. I think the government still developing or preparing the operational laws or guideline for the implementation. Yeah, but at the moment it's still like businesses also expect more incentive, in particular for companies that brave and also to advance more in low carbon or low emission initiative or transition.
Yeah, thank you. So Marliana spoke about the announcement that was made in Bursa Malaysia. Bursa Malaysia is a stock exchange in Malaysia, by the way. So in December last year, we launched a voluntary carbon market. It's called the Bursa Carbon Market, BCX. So look it up. And in fact, today, well, it's a market that we're trying to create, and it's a whole ecosystem of players in the market, right? Today, we launched the auction. So we started with an auction of 2 projects to actually go into price discovery a little bit and you know, try to figure out what's the carbon pricing like for Malaysian investors or even investors in the region. So that's one sort of big contribution in terms of the incentive, if I can share, where you know projects can be listed on the Bursa Carbon Exchange, and the voluntary carbon market is ready. And today is the first auction of 2 projects. So last week there was an announcement from Mariana. Last week there was an announcement from Bursa Malaysia to actually set up a centralized platform, an ESG reporting platform. That was an announcement. So the team in Bursa Malaysia is looking at, you know, how to integrate some of the parts that are already in existence. So it's about the listed companies, and it's also about the SMEs. So, you know, the platform is you know, has been designed. The rollout will be announced at a later stage, but there's a lot of movement there to actually create a centralized platform. So that's the plug for Malaysia. Winnie has a question on, in terms of ESG implementation across the sort of supply chain versus marketing versus other operations, what would the areas you would recommend to approach first? This goes to any of the panelists. Do jump in. That's Winnie Pua. Wira?
Not yet. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, thinking.
Yeah.
I can take this
Anybody
one.
ready? Thanks,
Yeah,
Tamara.
no problem. And so I think for this one, I hate to sound like an economist, although I apparently often do. It's a little bit of an it depends. It depends a bit on your company and which areas are most natural for your company. There are a couple of things that are easier than others for everyone. So, you know, I like to say people start by starting, right? So you can think about things like, how do you put in robust hiring policies for diversity? How do you make sure you don't have a gender pay gap? Can you swap to green energy for your buildings, your procurement policies? So there are little things like that, depending the kind of company that you can look to do internally for yourselves first. I will always support the idea of pushing for a board mandate to make sure the board is thinking about sustainability, and to task the board with having a corporate transition plan. That has become increasingly a requirement for certain types of investment anyway, so it'll help the business to do this. I think there is another piece here, and you know, both Priyanka alluded to and Wira alluded to this. Priyanka talked about the idea of being bottoms up and the power of the employee in the company. And I think for the power of the people, I think that's very much the case when it comes to sustainability, because every one of us has something we can impact. We just have to choose what we care about. So if you are an HR professional and you have power over hiring or hiring policies or payroll, do something like include gender in your data so that you can start reporting on gender pay gap. Because right now, one of the biggest problems is people don't have the data, so nothing gets done. If you're a procurement specialist, go and look and prefer green. So have a couple of questions around what's your policy on green. So you can at least ask people the question and make them think about it. Little baby steps that eventually will help us get there. We spoke about what's often seen as the silver bullet, the idea that regulation will change things. Regulation is the biggest driver of change. It makes things happen quickly. But if you think about what drives regulation, it's the people. So if you think about the pressure that's happening now in the UK, again, Women's Month, I guess, at this stage, where the gender pay gap leads to a gender pensions gap, and the UK budget that came out yesterday or today has literally tried to address that. So if there is momentum, if people are interested, if people care, people respond, organizations respond, and governments will respond. So I'll stop ranting, sorry.
Thank you. There are a lot of questions and I'm not sure whether we can keep up. Thank you everyone for your questions. I was told by the organizers, Arjun says we've got 20 minutes. So we'll go through the questions as fast as we should and need to. Vincent had a very interesting point that he made, and this is open for all the panelists. Doubts have been raised on rainforest carbon offset by established certifiers. What are your thoughts on this phantom credits? Allegations in our ESG integration journey. Who wants to take that one? That's from Vincent Tan. On
I can.
dubious sort of practices. Sorry, carry on, Tamara.
Yeah, I can take that. It is a personal view, and I'm lucky to not be representing anyone but myself today. I'm not a fan of carbon credits for reductions to begin with. I've always seen them as potentially furthering a problem than furthering a solution. I like carbon removal credits where you're taking it out of the environment. But one thing I will say, to be fair to people like Vera, is this is all new science. These are new business models, new things that are happening. No business comes out on day one and has a perfect record. What I think the industry needs to do is fix it and move on. Because one thing that I find very distracting and potentially a bit derailing and an impediment to progress is we get hung up on these things and we stop moving forward. So yes, there are problems with the way carbon credits have been issued in the past. The science has changed. The way we think about whether things are additive, or the way we think about credits even has changed. There is a huge backlog of credit issuances. There are not enough voluntary carbon credits being issued on these registries, particularly Vera and the gold standard. And so my suggestion is that pressure be put on people like Vera to do more in the space around the governance of how they run their credits. I think there are many technology solutions available these days that will help them do that, but they need to care enough. I don't want to tar any of the registries in particular, but the problem often is that these things are in commercial business models. They are there so that people can make money. In the case of the registry, they make money by issuing as much as they can. They outsource the verification, they outsource the audits. So there is a little bit less accountability through the chain, and some of those designs should be reviewed. So I guess I'm not sure that I'm properly answering the question. I think that, yes, there are phantom credits. I think some of them don't deserve to exist. They need to be burned. The credits need to be taken off the market and replaced with something else.
I like your point about carbon, taking the carbon away altogether. But where we do the carbon credit and offsetting is actually the transition part, because we do recognize that companies already are, harmful emitters. You need to transition them and then move them into actually taking the carbon completely out of their sort of operations.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I can
Priyanka.
chip in a little bit as well. And I think also while addressing one of the other questions on RECs, and I think, it's something on the offsets as well. So yes, it's a problem, that phantom credits and all, but let's look at the approach when decarbonizing first. So the first approach that's recommended normally in the roadmaps is measure first, start measuring your emissions, like where are they coming from, then start working towards reducing them by improving your efficiencies. And some may not be like as straightforward as electricity. Some may require you to think more design towards the Lean Sigma, kind of improving your efficiency in your processes. So first then goes to, so from measuring it goes to reducing. After that it comes to making or producing. What can you do in-house to produce energy? You have to buy less and you lose less on on T&D and things. And it's finally the procuring. So it's should be anyway at the end, the procurement part. So as much as we focus on the first three parts on measuring, reducing, producing, making our processes efficient, the issues on procurement will anyway will become a little bit less. And then hopefully we'll have to, and yes, there is a lot of need on improving the governance around certifiers and accreditation companies around the carbon credit space. I'm not going to name anyone, but there were other regulators which got closed, kind of now have died off. So hopefully that shouldn't be the trend now on with the existing ones, because yes, the technology is yet to be made for some of the scope 1 emissions, which are very process driven. So until then, it's a transition one. Very much agree with Shareen there. It's a transition one, but yes, there are other items that we can also do to decarbonize before jumping onto the procurement part.
Great, thank you. So our topic today is about integration. So I'm going to bring it back into questions around integration. And Harry has got a good question there. Integrating ESG in the business strategy is quite challenging. Sure, especially in organizations that don't fit or accommodate these sort of elements of ESG. What are the suggestions or thoughts from the panel in terms of how you would structure it to develop it so that it's aligned, the ESG sort of objectives is aligned and integrated into the business? Anybody wants to take that? That's Harry Ginjara. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. How do we really integrate ESG into business?
Okay, I can start and I'll pass it on to the other panelists quickly. So there are a few approaches of ESG integration, and again, one must have an alignment from the board and the C-suite and the leadership to be able to actually be able to integrate it. So some of the ways of integrating ESG is like starting with a policy that works, and that policy can't be a Word document lying somewhere in the SharePoint. The organization really has to resonate with the values of what's in the policy. Then regularly comes the stakeholder engagement, and those stakeholders has to be internal as well as external. So from the policy towards stakeholder engagement, and then very much towards the implementation of the policy, which shouldn't be missed out while just doing big talks. And again, a green finance, like the financing part of it, becomes an overarching part of the whole integration as well, because of course it's very important to have the finances to be able to really implement it. Passing on to the other panelists.
Okay, I would like to continue. Yep, I think what is the integration of ESG also start with the materiality assessment, yeah, based on the core business of its company, and basically actually ESG relate to how companies will tackle risk, and also to seize the opportunities that its businesses can seize the opportunities. Yeah, so what is the ideal process? Usually should start with the materiality assessment from companies, and then the companies will develop a strategy and plan. And then also recently it encouraged that companies need to disclose, yeah, their accountable or relating to the accountability, that this ESG is not just greenwashing, but the company is accountable because their initiative based on their evidence base, based on their materiality assessment. And then by considering the assessment, the companies plan and make strategy to achieve, yeah, their ESG objective. And when the company is successful in doing this, I think it will bring benefit to company itself, yeah, because probably it will increase the revenue, because more customers will try to find or to buy their product, for example, but also in terms of the employee, in terms of the employee retention, the ownership of the company, so that the company will be more resilient through this process.
Great, thank you. I've asked the panelists over our chat to reply some of the questions, and write it there, because we're really going to be pressed for time. They're really great questions. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, we may not be able to address all of them, and I would encourage the panelists to type out your answers in the chat box. So we've got about 10 minutes to end the session, and I thought we switch gears in terms of a little bit, looking forward. And really, in the next 5 to 10 years, if 10 years is too long, maybe 5 years, what are some of the future trends that you see where, integration will sort of turn from being challenges to opportunities? So I'm merging the two last questions for our panelists and keeping them on their toes. So there's future challenges and opportunities, obviously, but in the next 5 years, where are some of the trends where you see the integration becoming really aligned or misaligned would be the challenges? Tamara.
Yeah, so lots of hope in my world. I was just writing a reply to someone saying, I have hope, it's ever eternal. But I guess I'll start with the good news. I think there's been a lot of progress, and from a finance perspective, super relieved that the maths is finally making sense. I've lived too long in my career now with people saying, oh, but does this really work? Is it going to be good investing? We're fiduciaries and we owe our investors a responsibility. Now the maths has come out, right? Because we've had enough time, and even the woke capitalism movement I spoke about earlier has been knocked back in a couple of places because it mathematically does not make sense. So I think my favorite examples was a couple of days ago, Kansas, of all places, proved that if they were to force companies, or not to legislate so that companies didn't have to adopt green practices, it would actually cost the state pension system $3.6 billion. So like now that the maths, the numbers are coming, people are kind of getting a little bit more on board. I think it's like that fiduciary argument kind of goes away a little bit. We have a bit more empowerment. Another one was, I think Aluminum proved out that if you were an active investor, so you were choosing deliberately to invest in sustainable organizations, they've outperformed now over 3, 5, and 10-year horizons. So it's proven the time. And I think there are some interesting things happening just day to day as well, right? We've seen tech firms who are very committed to doing no evil suddenly be reasonably unkind to the people they were letting go. And there's been a giant backlash, and now people don't want to work there anymore. And we all know hiring, retaining, and training people is really expensive, right? That's a bottom line pain. And these good people end up going to your competitors, which costs you in a slightly different way. And they go with knowledge. And so I think we're at a point now where we've it's almost a no-brainer. Some of these behaviors have to be done if you want your business to continue and thrive. It affects your ability to hire, it affects your ability to procure, it affects your ability to kind of conduct business. I think the challenge is we kind of, the thing I dislike the most about the way this stuff works is the commercial imperative. So there are many things out there driving the way we do things, the largest of which I would say is the incentive for profit or kind of wealth measures. We've had some talk here about how various exchanges, SGX has done stuff to support the listed companies in their reporting versus just done something as well. I find it interesting that this is offered to the listed companies who pay for their listings and maintain their listings, because again, the exchanges are they're profit making. They have to make money. So when they offer these solutions, they charge you for it. But to me, like, why is this a for-profit enterprise? Like, why is helping people do the right thing for profit? To me, that should be very much a non-profit structure, which is not to say you lose money. It means that whatever you make reinvests into itself, and it helps scale, right? You grow a pie. There are many ways you can monetize these things, but it doesn't have to be at 10x return or whatever the case has to be. In a similar vein, if we think about the carbon credits piece, and I saw a question from Justin around like what's stopping people doing a Vera 2? Nothing is stopping them. In fact, if the incentives continue the way they are, there's going to be loads of registries out there trying to fill the backlog that exists and just issue, because you make your money as a registry from issuance. And then along the way, people are making money from the audits, from the verification, and there's like friction all through that line. None of that needs to exist, right? Most of the stuff can be highly automated, can be done for like close to zero trust, can be done at scale, but then people make less money doing it. So I guess the question becomes like, what do we do in terms of the people building these businesses to break those models? The ventures I designed for this bank, who don't particularly appreciate this aspect of it, are almost always designed to be nonprofit. They're almost always designed to be empowering of the companies that we serve. And I'm just quite lucky that I found a bank willing to invest on that basis, but not enough people do. And so my challenge is, and I think, I'm sorry, I think it might have been Carlos who was asking this. If you have a business that can make that difference, find mission-aligned people. Go to people who are, have the same kind of ethos as you, and don't, as much as you can, be driven by the need to make billions of dollars.
Thank you, Wira.
Okay, on the what is the long-term, challenges, but also short-terms. I would like to underline the global risk report recently, global risk report 2023, that for the longer term, I think our challenges relating to the climate change, how we mitigate the climate change by reducing our emission. Then we also on relating to how we adapt, climate change adoption, and then we have to deal with the biodiversity loss as well, and then also with the disaster relating to climate that actually all of us already experienced. So I think what is the Paris Agreement to keep our planet, what is the 1.5 Celsius degrees, of our safe planet, that why we need to to reduce our emission, by all companies, including technology companies as well. And there are already guidelines how every companies can join in this net zero target, in particular how we will together achieve the 1.5 degrees maximum for to keep our planet safe. And then I think every companies, but also all key stakeholders probably are not aware yet, about these challenges. And although scientists already quite often emphasize these challenges, and I think although companies are not aware, but I think the movement now, in particular, to drive to the net zero emission by 2050, or Indonesia is by 2060 or earlier. And this one is, I think, the challenges all of us, because ESG basically also relate with how we tackle risk, including, of course, now is the biggest challenges is the climate risk, that probably we do not know the detail about the risk, the impact, but I think from the evidence of COVID-19, I think we, including businesses, need to think about this one. And then on the short term, I think it is also interesting that global risk also mentioned about the cost of living. I think recently we read, we experienced about the inflation and their impact for the people, in particular in their capacity to buy their food, their needs, daily needs. And I think the cost of living in the short term also become the challenges as well. So I mean, I just want to emphasize that our long-term ESG challenges finally have to also to deal with the biggest challenges, the long-term, in particular in relation with the climate risk that will impact on business operation, with our health as well, and also with the environment. Back to you. Sorry.
Good, thank you. That sums up our topic really well, to make businesses and organizations and people more resilient. Priyanka, you have the last 3 minutes or so. before we wrap up. Before we go to Priyanka, there is a closing poll. Remember, we mentioned at the start of the session that we have a closing poll. So Priyanka will have 3 minutes, and then we'll do a bit of the poll, and then we wrap up. Thank you.
Actually, I'm cognizant of the time, and I think the answer has been already well covered by the panelists.
Yeah. Arjun has been kind enough to say that we have another 5 to 10 minutes. So if you have anything to add to what's already been said.
I think that's okay.
You're good?
We can go towards
okay,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So Arjun, could you please launch the poll, the closing poll, and see where we are? We've got a lot of questions, and it's coming from various sort of perspectives, from technology, you know, from carbon credits and all the controversies around that. You know, some integration with businesses. And I love Tamara's point of view is that, you know, let's not make money out of ESG. Let's do it for the real purpose that it is, which is, you know, to keep the planet sustainable and all of us alive and well. So it's a good sort of dynamics of different point of views that are coming through. I'm very, very sorry we can't answer all of your questions. I think Tamara and Priyanka has done a brilliant job to help me with answering them. And let's see what the polls are saying to us. So we're closing it with, after what you've heard today, do you believe your firm can begin to fully integrate ESG in the next 3 years? I'm fearful to see what the answer is going to be. I hope we've convinced you somewhat. And I think you've got a really brilliant panel that gave a lot of insights based on their experience and expertise that they have. I wish we could talk more on this subject. It's a lot more to unpack. So 40% is saying that we can execute our plans. Yes, very well. Yes, there are things we can readily do to start. That's at 62%. 2% is still struggling with it, hard. Nobody says that it's not viable though. So
I think, Ms.
we did
Shareen,
our
those the people who are mentioning it is difficult and it takes a long time. I think their perspective will change after our next presentation. Let's see.
There you go. Thank you, Arjun. Good save, good save.
So we have a 66% participation, and members are still giving the response. So we'll wait for another few seconds, and then we'll move on to our next presentation.
Sure, sure. So in closing, thank you very much, everyone who's participated, and you're really, like I said, very thoughtful, very deep, very controversial in some sense questions, and I hope you know the panelists have done you know somewhat to explain to you, and I think a lot more needs to be discussed. We always need more time for topics like this, but you know, please join me in thanking our brilliant panel today, Tamara, Priyanka, and Wira, for their insights and their really experience and expertise and sharing today.